Welcome to Think Free with Stephen
and Daniel.
Two brothers breaking down ideas and ways of thinking about this thing we call life. Unlock your mind to explore more than you ever thought possible. Think Free.
All right, what do you got?
Well, I've just finished up reading, I think, did I tell you 3 books that are all pretty similar?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of was just started reading one and then another one popped up that was similar, and then the algorithm figured out to give me a suggestion for a third one. So listened to all of them, mostly working out and driving and that sort of thing. Audiobooks, obviously. So the first one is called The Fourth Turning is Here. And then the second one is a book called Nexus. And that one is by the same author that did Sapiens.
Oh, is it a new one of his?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I
think all 3 of them are fairly new. And then the third one I just finished is called The Singularity is Nearer by Ray Kurzweil. Remember that guy? I think you mentioned him a while back. He was on a Rogan podcast or something like that. But anyway, he's a futurist, and he developed the synthesizer, helped popularize it.
Okay.
Kurzweil synthesizer. So he wrote a book a couple decades ago called The Singularity is Near, and this was an update. The Singularity is Nearer.
Oh.
So I didn't read the original one.
Clever name for the second one.
Yeah, right. And I've heard the word singularity used to mean a few different things. In his definition of it, it's the merging of humanity and AI coming together to work together, basically augmented humans. And so I think he's saying like in the 2040s now, so not too far away. So that book, he's making all kinds of predictions about
like cyborgs.
Yeah, cyborgs, so not just robotics, but cognitive as well.
Okay.
So blending our brains to have the capacity to be augmented with the capacity of computers, basically. So just lots of overlap in the 3 books. Most of it was about just kind of an overview of where we've come with technology, where we're at, and where we're headed. But they kind of take different approaches to it. So the Kurzweil book, which is the one I most recently read, was fairly optimistic. He's a fairly rose-colored glasses guy about the future. He has some cautions, and here's what can go wrong. But overall, he seems pretty, thinks that we're going to end up in a lot better state as a species.
Because of AI?
Because of AI, because of robotics, because of technology. Yeah. That all those things are leading us towards more of a utopia and less of a Terminator Matrix sort of outcome. Yeah. And he gives a lot of good reasons for why he thinks that is. And I would say he's a little bit more like Star Trek The Next Generation expectation that we'll be able to build food replicators and, get not need money anymore, and basic needs will just be met by technology that will allow us to do things like space exploration and focus on higher values than just how do we survive, because we'll be able to take care of that. So one of the things that he's predicting, among other people, based on where the technology is headed. So the biggest thing that he keeps referring to is, we're not progressing at a linear pace, where it's exponential. And so we're at this cusp of where things are just going to explode because of the feedback loop that happens as the machines get smarter. Those smarter machines can build smarter machines, which then can collaborate with humans to build even smarter machines, and then eventually that becomes self-sustaining. So talking about something as simple as a 3D printer, which is basically an evolution of a dot matrix printer, which was a 2D printer. It would just drop droplets of ink on a page to form an image. Of course, 3D printing uses plastic or other materials to make a 3-dimensional image, but by dropping it in certain layers. So the technology is headed towards the space where we can theoretically build just about anything on an atomic level if we can figure out how to move atoms around. Just like instead of dropping droplets of ink or droplets of plastic, we can manipulate atoms into any configuration that we want. Some of the theoretical problems right now are, using some sort of a device that's small enough to be able to manipulate those atoms without what they call the fat finger problem or the sticky finger problem. So the the tongs or the forceps or whatever that would move the atoms around would just be too big and crush it, or it would adhere somehow to the atom would bond with whatever was moving it. So whether they end up using magnetism or some other forces to manipulate those atoms would be what would have to happen. But at that point, if you can construct things at an atomic level, you could probably build just about anything. You could have a food replicator or a house replicator or a vehicle replicator, assuming you could somehow harvest the raw materials for it. So just as an example, one of the things that he projects and expects that will better society as we merge with AI. He brought up an interesting thought experiment, which I was going to run by you and just see what your thoughts were on it. Which he conceives of an idea where there's a synthetic brain, which we're getting closer and closer to being able to match. Computing-wise, the brain is limited by of course, the size, but also the architecture of the brain and the way that the neurons fire and interact with each other. And silicon apparently has more potential to be able to fire quicker and more often and more throughput than the brain does, the human brain does. So it's conceivable that if we could figure out what consciousness is or how to extract memories in such a way, they could be hosted in a silicon brain, an artificial brain, an android of sorts. And so the idea is, if we can take all of your memories, everything that makes you you, and somehow put it into a digital form and host it on a silicone platform, is that you? Is that a you 2.0? I think he calls it a U2. And then so the question is, is it you from a scientific standpoint, and then is it you morally? Is it you ethically? If your body fails and you need to be, you could be transplanted into that android. Now, does that new android you 2.0, does it inherit all of your responsibility for all your past mistakes and all the benefits of your past accomplishments, or does it start over? Is it perpetual, that sort of thing? So that's one thought experiment. And then the second half of that is, let's say, you have you as a biological person with a mushy brain instead of a silicone brain, and a part of your brain gets damaged, and so they have to go in and remove it and replace that with a silicone brain, partial silicone brain that makes it up and keeps you whole and you're functioning, and nothing about you has changed. Your memories, your awareness, your identity, and all that stays the same. And then another part of your brain gets damaged, so they go in and take that out. And piece by piece, over the years...
Yeah, the wooden boat.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, you got it. So until eventually all you have is a silicone brain inside of your skull. As far as you're concerned, nothing's really changed. You're still you, but are you still you? Because now you have a silicone brain instead of a biological brain running around in the same body. Now those same ethical and moral questions. Are you still the same you? Has anything really changed? It happens so slowly, just like is the boat still the boat? And how is that? Is that different than just creating a completely separate you and transplanting those memories over? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I've heard some of these same kind of concepts and theories and challenges to what has been the commonplace in the past. I've been listening and reading about how for a long time it was like conceived that, or it was a consensus that we only use like 10% of our brain.
Right.
And that's pretty much been all but debunked.
Right. I've heard that too.
Not true. Yeah. And then the same thing with like even what memories are and whether they are actually stored and if they are actually memories. And so I then kind of take that with like thinking about like our very distant cousins, apes, and thinking about, okay, at some point our brains doubled in size, thinking about, okay, what would this question be like if we were talking about, say, an ape with the same question as far as like a silicone brain or a hybrid portion of it. So then thinking like, okay, about our idea and concept and thoughts about how complicated the brain was or is how mysterious it is, how powerful it is. If we presumably, what we're kind of is where most people have been coming to find out is that we kind of over projected on a lot of those concepts of how powerful it is and how mysterious it is. And it was, a lot of people are acknowledging that it was just simply we didn't know enough about the brain. Like I think we've even talked about on this podcast about, like, 50s and 60s drilling in people's brains and dropping, liquids and stuff.
Yeah.
And like having no idea what to do with people that were having brain problems. And so kind of like what you were talking about, that exponential, that's another thing I've been reading too, is just like how much our brains in our society just can't even comprehend how powerful exponential growth truly is.
We think very linearly.
Yeah.
When it comes to progress, because that's what
that's all experience. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So to think about what's going to be possible blows my mind. That's why, like, not to take this too far on a rabbit trail, but like even like UFOs or aliens or whatnot, arguing about, well, if it was possible, then we'd already have noticed some. Like, we don't even know what we don't even know.
Right.
No, like, but we not even close. And so to think that any of this, we understand the limits to anything, it's very ignorant. And so thinking about the question as far as if we would still be us, I think that's a really interesting question, because of all of the stuff that I mentioned then makes me think, like, it almost seems like we're giving individuality too much, putting it too high on a pedestal.
Oh, interesting.
Like
Okay.
we were putting other things like how powerful the brain was. And so then I think, well, yeah, like, what does even mean to be me? Like, if I don't have a spirit, if I don't go somewhere after I die, if I don't have an existence other than what I'm experiencing right now. So then I'd like try to think, like, okay, well, how am I different from that ape over there? Okay, we've all kind of understood that. Okay, well, I know I exist. My brain, because of evolution, where my brain is came compared to that ape, I have some of these abilities to be able to even have this conversation that we're having now.
Right.
But as far as that very specific individualism, me, I don't even know, what that would look like, to me being me compared to you being you. I don't know what it's like being you.
Yeah.
And I don't
It's pretty freaking great.
I'm sure it is. So I think that's challenging for anybody to be able to answer, like, if I'm still me when I'm in this synthetic thing.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. How would we even know or be able to judge that?
right.
Yeah.
Right.
What kind of measuring tool?
Even me, or even, it's just hard to even fathom, like, okay, so my memories and my conscious and my experiences go into this other thing, but like, it's not like we're a ghost, like, coming out of our body and then watching and then, like, seeing and then being able to, like, physically, or like in that ethereal world, like, go into that other being and being like, oh yeah, this is me, or being like from afar, no, that's not me. Right. Like, guys, that's not really Daniel.
It's a continuity thing that we can't put our finger on. What would continuity look like?
Right.
Unbroken.
Yeah.
Me-ness, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So then by doing that, so we have that ability or the technology to be able to say, put those memories, experiences into that thing. And what are we trying to really do? Just preserve for the other people around that person to be able to preserve their experiences and memory and time with that person.
Right. Well, yeah. And that's basically part of the future casting is, okay, so then it creates all these other sorts of problems like overpopulation or, like, eventually you want to just die, right? But no, there's new realities or new modes of existence yet to come that we can only maybe be able to scratch the surface to be able to conceive of. Virtual reality, might be the place where all of these disembodied souls go to live out eternity or something like that. And then the capacities of a virtual world to store our life experiences feels much more relatively infinite than the planet's ability to sustain, humans who just won't die. Because obviously that would be a problem eventually.
Yeah.
Talk about exponential growth,
Right.
So we need other modes of experiencing reality, basically, which aren't impossible to think of. But how that would look and where we would go and how is that better? That's all like stuff on the horizon, too far away so far, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think even thinking about okay, eventually everyone's gonna want to just die, like Wolverine or whatever, right. Movies that you've seen or whatever, that experiences of that. Yeah, because if there is, let's say there's no absolutely zero afterlife, there's nothing that happens to quote unquote air quotes consciousness when you die. Not really a bad thing about dying. You're not going to be sad,
right?
You're not going to wish you were still alive. So really, I think it's about, any of it could be about extending the useful and healthy portions of the time of your life for a little bit longer. So even you don't want to live till you're 120, but being crippled and dying and all your parts are deteriorating, failing. But you would want to be 120 if that means that your best years of your life, you had 40 more of them or something like that for it, where you're making the most amount of money, you're around other people, you're able physically to do a lot of things. So it is an interesting concept of death, and thinking about in that world of potential where we could be going with AI, of saying, well, I don't, how many people are even going to want to do that if that was what it was and you were yourself? I don't know. There's just a lot there.
Yeah, and that's a great transition to another fascinating portion of this prediction model, was about extending physical life, not just our consciousness in a augmented or a silicone state, but he's talking about something I never heard of before, but I think if I remember correctly, it was called the aging. The aging escape velocity, but escape velocity was the key, which is borrowed from aeronautics, where in order to escape the Earth's gravitational pull for a rocket to get into space, it has to hit a certain velocity to escape that pull, and it doesn't really matter if you go much faster than that as long as you hit that number. But if you only get to 99% of the escape velocity, you won't be able to leave the atmosphere, and so that's a critical number to be able to hit if you're going to get out to space. And so that they use that for aging to say there is a point at which technology is adding a certain amount of lifespan in a given time period. So let's just, for round numbers, let's say in 10 years, technology has been able to add an average of 1 year to a human's lifespan. But again, because of exponential growth, it may only take 9 more years for another year to be added to people's lives, and then only 8 years, and so on. And I'm not quoting those exact numbers. Yeah. It's just for example purposes. And then at some point, the number of years added to a person's life will happen faster than the number of years passing in that person's life. And so basically the sands of the hourglass start going backwards, because the longer you live, the longer you're going to be able to live. Because now this doesn't obviously preclude you from having an accident or some sort of illness that hasn't been curable, but just for the actual process of aging that would lead to death in and of itself, because of the deterioration of the cells and the stuff that gets built up, the waste products that are able to be processed out. And that's a very crude way of kind of summarizing what happens with aging is that our bodies just can't handle all the waste products and all the dead cells. And we do great at it when we're young, but it builds up and over time, which is why you mentioned 120 years. He said there's only one person that's been verifiably lived to 120 years. There's plenty of people in pre-developed countries that claim they've lived longer than that. We don't know because we don't have record keeping or even keep time the same way that Westerners do. So it's unverifiable. Maybe they do, but it's essentially, it's kind of a cutoff point for humanity right now. And he predicts that the first person to live to 150 has already been born, is already alive right now. And not that we have the technology to keep somebody alive to 150, but by the time they would have been dying, there will be enough there to keep extending their lifetime. So if we follow the escape velocity hypothesis, then essentially, barring accidents or catastrophes or diseases, even our human flesh, our bodies could potentially live indefinitely, whether we want to or not, or whether we should, or whether that's good for the planet, or maybe by then we explore other planets, and that's not a constraint. But man, it's like stuff's changing fast. Like I'm just going personal now. All of a sudden, this isn't in the book. But I talked to my wife. I'm 45, and we've joked for a long time that every generation thinks, boy, when I was younger and how much things have changed. And I go back to the technology of how much the printing press changed. And that's in one of the other books, the Nexus book, they talk about that, or how much automobiles changed the technology, the way that people communicated, and the telephone, and of course the internet. And there's been all these things throughout fire. Like, oh my gosh, can you imagine if there was a time when humans existed before fire, and then they had fire, from a cooking, from a destructive, from working past sunset, from warding off predators, that would have just been groundbreaking technology, stuff that we can barely even conceive of that impact. So I think it's very common for a generation to say, wow, things are changing quickly compared to 100 years ago, or compared to when I was a kid.
Is there a but coming?
Yeah. For sure. But maybe this is the time that is really changing fast. Because if my grandkids are able to offload their consciousness into a Android, or live indefinitely in a metaverse, or my grandkids or great grandkids could literally live to 1,000 years old in their current body, like that, I don't know. That's hard to compare to a printing press or the automobile or fire. But again, it's all relative. So compared to those people not having those things, and I don't know what the point is of comparing anyways, because what does it matter? I've started to get this feeling that I've always scoffed at for so long, that back when I was a kid, we used to only blah, 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 or we only had 2 channels on TV, and now you guys got 100. I'm like, okay, not a big deal, Grandpa, whatever. The world changed so much on you. But for the first time, I'm starting to feel like, and the reason it's significant is because it's destabilizing. It can be.
It's really impactful in the life that you're living.
Yeah,
whereas
exactly.
more channels wasn't that impactful.
It doesn't seem like it. Yeah. And I wouldn't say, our kids they don't have to wait for a movie to come out, or for a show they missed on Friday night to come back out on reruns or syndication. Like, you can just literally watch any movie or any show or any episode of any series if you know where to look, and maybe have to pay $19.99 to rent it or something like that's pretty incredible, and that's changed. But that's not the impact I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like, that's significant, but that's not the feeling that I'm
that's the channel example,
right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's something, but the way that we will interact with not only ourselves, but with biology and with technology, which silicon-based intelligence just wasn't even on anybody's radar 100 years ago, much less being developed. That just seems like a more profound change to the way humans act. But again, that's maybe what fire felt like, and maybe what transcontinental planes felt like. I don't know. I wasn't there, so I can't say this is a bigger deal, but it feels like it's a bigger deal. and the head swiveliness of it all, which apparently is only going to get more intense, with this exponential growth that we're talking about.
So do you think, with silicon, we're talking about computer chips,
Right. That's what I mean by silicone. Yeah.
Yeah. Not like silicone implants, like
No, right.
yeah,
But
butt implants or something like that.
No.
Okay, yeah.
Thanks
so,
for clarifying.
So with silicon, thinking about like consciousness, like being offloaded, are you and or any of these people that are much smarter that are writing these books that you read thinking that the technology will still just be ones and zeros that are creating that conscious, that are the base for that consciousness?
Yes, for now. But,
Okay.
but that's part of that. That has a theoretical limit to it. I think quantum computing maybe is like the next generation or the next generation, as opposed to the binary on-off switching. However, from what I understand, binary switching of on and off is sufficient to replicate the way we understand the brain to work of the firing of neurons. The interconnectedness of it, and he goes through Kurzweil, as he goes through this explanation that probably makes a lot more sense in print if you can see it right now, but trying to listen to it is hard. It's basically just like an if-then tree for intelligence. And but it's multiple layers, 10, 20, 50, 100 layers deep of, if this is true, then do this. But if that's true, then do that. And then if that true is, then this, and then at all these different stages. And so as you go down through all these layers of, the tree gets bigger and bigger and bigger, because every generation or layer, the possibilities, compound of what you could have. And so it's a model that then has to be trained. This is basically the architecture behind artificial intelligence. Has to be trained on all the possibilities that could happen and what to do for each scenario or how to react. Yet our brains seem to do that, I guess, intuitively, but they're still doing a similar type of process. But with just, if this happens, then I do that. If that happens, then I do this. But because it's so multi-layered and it's not just one decision or any other. So even the fact that a computer can not only beat the smartest human at chess or checkers, but there's a game called Go, which is one of the most popular games in the world, especially in Eastern cultures, not Asian cultures. A strategy game called Go. Are you familiar with it? Little stones you use. It's a big grid, and you use different colors, like white and black stones, and two opponents, and you have to like put them around each other's just stones to take them off the board. But the algorithms used to be good at Go are much more complex than chess, because chess has a very specific set of possible moves that are relatively
so
learnable.
Like the tree of if this then that is not very large for chess, because there's a lot of
restrictions So computers have gotten to the point where they could simulate and understand every possible scenario of chess games that could exist, because of the limited number of moves. There's still like 10 to the 14th or something crazy. But Go is just, multiples of that, even more so. And the strategies behind it, the computers eventually learned to beat the masters by developing new strategies that the masters couldn't even understand. Like the human people couldn't understand why the computer chose to take that route, which looked like it was not going to work, but eventually it ended up, they were able to win like 3 out of 5 games or something like that. And they couldn't even figure out, and they couldn't get the computer to explain to them how it came to that conclusion. But it just made sense. Where was I going with this? Oh, yeah. So the that's where the AI technology is at right now, being able to solve problems. However, if you ask that same computer something simple like, what will happen if I drop this chicken's egg from a height of 3 feet onto a floor, they can't always return the answer. It'll crack and make a mess, or something that a 5-year-old would understand. They did a test where it was complicated. I can't remember it, but it was something that basically required, if a human listened to the same description, it says, I have a teacup, and inside of this teacup is a thimble. The thimble fits very loosely inside of the teacup, and I take the teacup and I set it on my bed, and then I lift the teacup off my bed and put it upside down on my chair. Then I pick up the teacup and put it back on the bed again. Where's the thimble? And it took lots of years of training for the computer to be able to understand that the the thimble would have fallen out of the teacup when they put it on the chair. Yeah, as opposed to the bed, which any human basically that can visualize what's happening knows, oh yeah, that would just fall out once you turn it upside down. So those sorts of computations and calculations and reasoning about the world are what the new frontier is right now for AI, but solving problems that 99.99% of humanity would never be able to do, winning the Go game, because there's like only a handful of people in the world that are even can hang with those computers right now. But such simple things like what will happen with it if an egg drops, or where did the thimble end up, are where it still needs training and time to process in our brains to somehow do that. So to answer your original question, I believe the ones and zeros and the binary calculations are sufficient. However, it probably is going to hit a limit at some point, and then there'll have to be some new thing, which hopefully the computers will help with.
Yeah,
it's quantum.
Well, I was thinking about too, like consciousness going into the silicon chips, like, and we're thinking about, okay, is that still me? And then thinking also about why we want to live longer, why we might want to live forever, why do we want to live at all? All of this being under the assumption that there's nothing after death. Right. It seems to me that it's about experiences. And like, if you think about, okay, if I went into just this completely metallic robotic body with a silicon brain, and what I perceive as consciousness in life right now, I would be seeing through the eyes of this robotics and be thinking, why would I want to continue living? Oh, like experiencing my kids and my grandkids and like doing things. Okay, well, why do I want to experience those? Like, comes back to like chemical releases, like dopamine and like, oh, we talk about like memories, like, oh, why do we have fond memories? Like, oh, we remember that those chemical releases that happen at that. So it almost seems like you would need the silicon to synthetically replicate that feeling of that dopamine release based on experiences.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
And it wouldn't have to necessarily be, chemical or liquid or anything like that, but it would still, that would be something for it. But it's interesting, just like,
yeah, that's true.
If there is nothing after death, and there's and we don't believe that there is. So if someone doesn't believe that there is, and there truly isn't, then really the only thing that they're doing here right now is having more dopamine hits, more chemical hits of those differences for it, and allowing and creating those also to occur in those people around them that they love, right, as well. And so, yeah, I just think that would be an important portion of what we would need for that silicon to be able to replicate.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great point. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the sense of how I think you were talking about in one of these about our relationships, our feelings of fondness for another person, our recognition, our, all those things, the warmth that we sense when a loved one is in our presence, or we see somebody that we miss that we haven't seen for a long time. That all those things are basically best explained by the firing of neurons in our brain. It's a connection that's happening in our own body. We sense it as a warmth or a connection between two people. We, the nonverbals, the facial gestures, that everything that's occurring reinforces those things. At the end of the day, though, it's all happening just inside your brain. Between the two people are having their own, individual experiences, and then sharing those with each other and enhancing them because of the interaction. I don't mean to take anything away from it.
And I think they're able to identify that because of past experiences. Right. So you interpret that body language to then represent experiences you've had in the past, which then fire those neurons to be like, oh, they're showing some love or support or whatever from that.
And I care about this person means I get a certain cerebral response when they're in my presence. Right. Yeah. So then I was thinking about when we lose a loved one, there's the common parlance that we say, I sense that they're still with me. They've lived on in my memories, or that sort of thing. And it makes a lot of sense that our brain is still recalling or firing or registering, or, paranormal activity of, my late husband is still in the house with me. And at 6 o'clock every night, I still hear him walking down the hall like he did when he was alive, or something like that. Like, I don't necessarily buy the paranormal explanation. However, our brains probably are maintaining a certain familiarity there in the way they're firing, because that's, if we say we miss somebody, we love somebody, what we're talking about is not an interpersonal event. It's about a interpersonal event that's happening, that we frame a story as happening between two people. It's different ways. So an intersubjective reality we could simulate, we could reproduce, we could, if we took that into account somehow. Yeah, it'd be an interesting way to do it without necessarily having to have the exact same chemicals flowing around.
Right. It's kind of weird to think about, because then you're almost having the computers having to calculate and assess all of that, and then give that to itself, or
I know it's
having.
So
that's why
weird.
I was like, oh, seems really hard to wrap my head around, as far as how that would work, as far as us going in there. But then that's what goes back, just like, what is it?
What does it mean?
What does it mean, me? Like, what does that mean? Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of another point that he brought up, which was talking about a Turing test. Alan Turing was essentially like the godfather of computers, with the what do they call them, the punch cards. And so I think Alan Turing expected or projected a type of a singularity, basically, where a computer could convincingly fool humans into thinking that it itself is a human. And any of us who have interacted with a chatbot or ChatGPT or any of these other things, we know that hasn't happened yet. Because eventually you can tell that you're dealing with a bot if you stay with it long enough. But the Turing test, I think there's some guidelines about there's going to have to be some judges who ask questions to a panel consisting of however many humans, and then there's one computer that's inserted that's autonomous. It's not being controlled or manipulated or puppeteered by anybody. And then they all get asked these questions, and the computer has to fool the judges into thinking it's one of the humans. In other words, they can't tell out of the answers that keep getting given by the respondents which one is the human and which one is the computer. And we're not there yet, apparently. But one of the things that's significant is that the computer is going to have to dumb itself down in order to pass the test. Because one of the things that will give it away is if it always gets it right and always knows the correct answer and always does it. So it's going to have to learn how to be fallible and to come up short, or to give a wrong answer, or to not use the correct syntax sometimes in ways that humans do, because we're not perfect and we make mistakes and we get things wrong or say it backwards or mess it up. So it'll have to learn how to do it the right way. So that's one of the limitations of the Turing test right now. If you just, I think Watson beat, the Jeopardy champions or something a few years ago, was a big deal. But all that did is just demonstrate the ability to index encyclopedic knowledge. It didn't necessarily convince us that it was a human. So for an AI to look like a human, it has to also learn how to throttle itself back, which reminded me a little bit of what you're saying about releasing the right amount of chemicals at the right time. Like if it just floods it with what it thinks we want all the time, like that's not the point. It's the contrast. It's the having to work for it. It's the struggle to get it, at least biologically up to this point. That's how our brains have evolved to reward us for struggling.
Yeah, and then and also, does that mean that that's not you? That's just a computer program at that point? Right. Wait a minute. If your consciousness supposedly is on the silicon, but the silicon is having to do calculations and
regulate
programs and regulate.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it gets confusing. And then it's interesting too, think about, if you're like what you were talking about, the Turing test. Okay. And then you were like, oh, I got Chat GPT. Well, think about like what even Chat GPT is. Not super technical, but just thinking, okay, that's a program running on a server somewhere on servers. So, okay. So now we're talking about like, okay, so if your brain goes into silicon, it can't be on just a server. Okay, so then that's like the Will Smith movie, iRobot. Okay, so like if you're like you're in one of those, like, okay, so if the power dies, is that going to be the same as like our brain dying or like our heart shutting off, and then that you can never come back again? If you can just come back again by plugging you back in, are you really you or your consciousness? Like how, like not just staying on a little bit of a battery,
Right.
like think about like completely.
Well, there'd be cloud-based backup farms. So just like you back up your computer, you back up your consciousness.
Gosh.
Which I vaguely remember some sci-fi movies playing with this already. So
Okay.
yeah, so if the robot that's hosting your consciousness gets smashed in a car accident or falls into a vat of lava or something crazy like that, like there's still a cloud backup of you that can just be inserted into another one. But is that you or like right? And then it would like probably like restart from the last time the backup was made, just like a time machine on your computer. If you
Or you could just be in the cloud server and just be controlling the machine.
That's true too.
And then that,
or not even need an analog presence at all if it's all virtual. That was the whole metaverse thing. It was just like we create a new reality where we all exist as bits and bits. But then is that humanity anymore? Whoa. It's like, then who's like keeping the water changed in the coolers, the super coolers or something.
well, I'm even thinking too, like I think there is a possibility that we as a species are naively thinking that this is the future and the next step of our evolution, because we have a limited brain structure and haven't evolved, not even just like in evolution's definition, but just evolved of our understanding and knowledge of how space and time works. Right. Like you think about all these UAP conversations over the last 6 years that's been having, like there's still one really known tribe in the Amazon that still supposedly is like one of the last tribes that has never had any outside contact at all. And so then like we've had conversations, obviously our 4th podcast or whatever, about ancient civilizations. Right. Okay, so think about any civilization in the past, like you were saying, couldn't even been fathomed about some of this computer programming and type of communication. So talking about these UAPs, literally orbs coming out of the ocean, like there could literally be species all around us, and we're that tribe in the Amazon, and they're not wanting to communicate with us. But then you still have like these photos of us sending a drone to look at the Amazon people, and they're like all like standing there just staring up at it. So it's like this exact same thing of like the UAPs. They're like, what is that? Right. Like, they have no idea, and they can't even conceptualize how that would work. And everybody all talks about like, oh, it was just there and it moved 1,000,000 miles an hour out of the distance and it went sideways, but there was no propulsion. It's like, you're still thinking limited of like, oh, how could this be the Chinese or the Russians if they were using this? But like, it could just be completely not even conscionable of us to be able to even understand. And maybe that's what we're going to break into. Right. As far as the next days, but
cut through in the same way that that if you plopped one of those tribal people and just plucked them out and plopped them into a modern scientific institution surrounded by autonomous robots and the culture shock, just the complete mind that it would be.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, like or X amount of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, somebody, we pick somebody up before the fire was invented,
Right.
and we bring them here right now.
Yeah.
Like not even something that they could even think of. I mean,
Right.
people living up in the clouds, in the skies, like, all of this stuff over throughout history that we have written down about people talking about crazy things. And then thousands or hundreds of thousands of years later, we find out, it's this,
Right.
it's that.
There's the explanation.
There's an
for it.
explanation for it. Yeah, our brains weren't even able to get there because we didn't have the 10,000 steps before
Right.
that to be able to get to it, the math and the science and understanding. And so like, even just thinking about like, a lot of people will argue, like I said in the beginning, there's no life out there, because if there was, there's so much opportunity. We haven't seen it. So that means that there probably isn't. It's like even just the speed of light. And it's like, we're stuck right now at being able to even describe certain things because things can only travel the speed of light. Like that's the fastest, but it's like that, 100 years or 1,000 years from now may just blow the top off of that. And it's
Right.
not even something that's remotely within what we're talking about, like just like the Interstellar, movie. Like, it's just like no, we didn't even have an understanding of what space and time really even are. And we were thinking about this one way, and that wasn't even close.
It changes everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Much like the your example of the tribesman that looks up at a drone would most likely either have an animal or a spiritual context to try to place that
Right.
in. It would have to be some sort of bird we've never seen, or it's one of the spirits that we worship, or our
Right.
ancestors, or something along those lines.
Exactly,
Assuming,
yeah.
And I could be wrong, but that would be an analog for what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think by what we have for recorded history, then if that repeated event potentially happens, and it happens on certain periods of time, then they're going to relate
Right.
that to being like, comes around every time that there's a storm, or every time that we have a famine, or
Right.
every time we sacrifice somebody or something.
I think it was our last episode. Did I talk about the religion called John Frum?
Oh, no.
That just reminded me of it. It was in the book that I mentioned that you gave me, but I'd also heard about it. Maybe it was on a podcast or another book I'd read. But some of the South Pacific Islanders, who are sort of pre-modern in a similar way that you're talking about, who had very little, if no, exposure to the outside world, that during World War I or II, I think World War II, the U.S. established bases in some of these islands, Polynesian, South Pacific islands, who had not seen any type of technology or anything like that, and were living very meagerly and very modestly. And so the U.S. basically just came in and was like, hey, we're bigger and stronger, and we need to create this base for our fleet and to be able to launch from here, and we're just going to do it.
We've never really done it before.
Yeah, weird. U.S. being colonial, I know, it's so odd. And so, and in doing that, they built ad hoc airports, basically, so they could land their cargo planes and bring resupplies and those sorts of things. And so they would cut down swaths of the jungle, build an airport, and then planes would land, or they would drop. Build drop areas where they parachute and cargo would come out of the sky. And apparently the natives benefited from some of this. It was a complete, just like annihilation of them. They didn't go in and just destroy them and burn their houses down or anything like that. They coexisted with them, from what I've been told. But the natives associated cause and effect, and basically still to this day attempt to build airports to get things to drop from the sky, because in their minds, in a mystical sense, if you build an airport, they will come. It wasn't that their planes want somewhere to land, so we need to build an airport for them. It was a ritual. And so it's called the John Frum religion, because he was John from the USA, or John from America was like John was the, kind of the popular name to placeholder for your, good old US soldier. And so they still have rituals to this day, as far as I know, on some of these islands where they dress up like soldiers, and they build these little mock airports and try to get things to parachute out of the sky. Crazy. And that's their religious belief. And John is going to come back. Like there's going to be a second coming, and he's going to come back and all this sort of thing. So it's silly to us because we understand why they built the airports and how that contributed to the planes being able to land and bring all the goods, which enriched their lives. Like they went from being, pre-modern to having all these luxuries they couldn't conceive of in the blink of an eye to them, because it was valuable staging territory for a military advancement. But in their mind, they made that leap in that span. And then they did what made sense to them. They associated one action with another, which was related, but not necessarily causal. And despite their best efforts to reproduce it and do it the exact same way, it hasn't, because we don't need that space anymore. So they've been abandoned.
Right.
So just interesting the way our minds work. So man, I can't stop thinking of things like, remember Fly the Navigator from when we were a kid? Do you remember that movie with the ship that could turn invisible, and just by the way that it refracted light or something like that. I'm sure there's other movies like that too, but I'm just thinking about like what other things could be happening all around us at some sort of different dimension, or just bending light in a way that we can't conceive of, or traveling at the speed of light, or these little glimpses we have into quantum entanglement and two different elements acting, responding identically, even though they're across the country or something like that. Like little glimpses of a whole world with reality that we can't even conceive of.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And,
so maybe the singularity will help us unlock some of that, or could lead to that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That might be something that, propels us and helps us move towards that. It seems, it just seems like there's a very large, it seems to me that it's probable that there's a much bigger mystery than how do we get our consciousness into AI or into silicon or whatever, because that's still just us thinking from our current perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Just translating it over to another version of what we understand. Which is just, let's make a brain like ours, but make it out of silicone instead of tissue. Right. Which is just such a tiny step compared to what it could be. Yeah. So a lot of times in these kinds of situations that, you hear that sort of regretful adage, we were so focused on whether or not we didn't stop to ask if we should, and that's usually said in the aftermath of some colossal disaster that resulted from people pushing progress or whatever. I was going to say, is that something that applies here? But my thought now, I want to see what you think about this, is I don't even know if that's a worthwhile question to ask. Like, we're doing it. We're marching towards a singularity. People have opposed progress for, as long as we've recorded history, and they became known as the Luddites sometime in the 1500s maybe, but they had a leader that supposedly, whose last name was Ludd, and opposed the weavers, looms. Yeah. When the looms started being developed, weavers, which was a very skilled art at the time, developing clothes, were being put out of business because the machines now could do their job. And so their art and their craft was becoming obsolete. And so they formed a resistance, tried to burn the weaving looms and stop the advancement. And their mysterious leader's last name was Ludd. I don't remember, Alan Ludd or something. I don't remember his first name. But so they became called the Luddites. And now in perpetuity, anytime people oppose progress in technology, they're referred to as Luddites. Which obviously that's never really done any good. Anytime people have opposed progress in technological advance, eventually they lose, despite any, temporary halting they might accomplish. So do you think that's an appropriate question to ask that's talking about putting our consciousness in silicone or any of these other wild things? Are there ethical questions, or is it just like, screw it, it's happening? There isn't a question, it's not a should, it's just, it is. What do you think?
I would probably say that, it's more of just, it is. And it maybe the question is, should we do it smartly or have guidelines or talk about it, or almost in the same fashion of like when we're coming up with a nuclear
Right.
bomb, like
Right. Agreements. And,
yeah, some kind of conversations and what does that look like? But I think whether we should or we shouldn't, I think I agree with Joe Rogan on this about like, I would say that, yeah, that doesn't matter because he's a pretty firm believer that like one of the large differences between us and apes is that we are a species that continues to invent and build things. Like that's like our like mission in life, like our goal. And so that's like, and the unique thing about us that no other species on this planet does.
Right.
Creates and builds tools at an ever increasing.
Yeah. There's no, like, that's enough.
Yeah. We're constantly wanting more, better, efficient, bigger, cooler. And so, where I think like even just recently, it's like they've seen like apes like use a stick to like grab things or like do things with, like, and that's like the farthest that they've gone.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you can't, I don't think so. I would agree with him. Like in this situation, I'd be like, well, yeah, I don't think you can really stop that train from going down that track. Like it's going, like it's just going to continue going.
Yeah, and the ethical question isn't about like should we or shouldn't we. It's because like it's going to happen. So what's the most ethical way to do it? What are some of the guidelines or guardrails that we put in place? Let's have conversations that try to maintain our definition of human dignity as long as we understand what that means, or something along those lines.
Yeah, or kind of like what we've talked about before, as far as my position going on this topic of like minimalizing humans' pain and suffering,
right,
would be my opinion on that.
Yeah,
that whatever that looks like. It's the same thing with like the nuclear bombs. Like, okay, like develop this, like, and let's make sure that we're doing it in a way that's minimizing or eliminating, human pain and suffering.
Yeah, that's a great metric, great standard to adhere to.
Man, you went down the rabbit hole reading these books, huh?
And only scratched the surface of some of the stuff I was gonna. Yeah. There's a lot of fun things to think about. It was provocative. I certainly can't do them justice, but
yeah, for sure. They were pretty good reads.
I would say so. Yeah. The first one, since we're on the topic about the first one I mentioned, which was the fourth turning is here. I think what I appreciated about that the most was not so much that it didn't so much predict the future technologically, but what it did was it introduced me to or gave me compelling reason to rethink my perception of time, because it makes a great case for not looking at time in a linear fashion, as things are always progressing or things are going backwards or things are getting better or whatever. But it's more of an Eastern sense of a turning, in the sense of a wheel turning. Buddhists and Hindus have talked about this for thousands of years, the Chinese, that everything's just a cycle. It comes back around again. And so the fourth turning is a way of talking about like an epoch or a new age that's not new. It's just another version of the thing that's happened already. So it's not like we're just repeating the past. It's more like there's nothing new under the sun. Things just kind of go in cycles. And so what we think is new is only new because we haven't lived it in a previous cycle. He talks about there's things being like saeculum, which is a Roman term. It's referred to basically a generation, a lifespan, 80 years, something like that, and 80 to 100 years. And within each of that time frame, there's a 20 to 25 year period, which is a turning. And things happen institutionally, things happen in our perception of the world, things happen with our economics, with the relationships between countries. And so he goes back through time and just talks about during the War of the Roses, this is what was happening. And during the American Revolution, this is what's happening. And of course, after the American Revolution, this is what happened because it followed this pattern. And so he's kind of pointing out these patterns that are all throughout history that get repeated in our human cycle. And it, of course he doesn't say this, but what some of the conclusions are of course, Donald Trump got elected because of where we are in these cycles and where we are in these saeculum. And it's not so much an inevitability of things happening. It did remind me a little bit of that in the Matrix series with, the computer talking to Neo and just being like, you're not the first, you're not the first savior. This is how it goes. And we get everybody's hopes up, and then Zion forms, and blah, blah, blah. So it had a little bit of that air to it, a little bit of that ring to it.
Is that the theory about like, there's 4 20-year periods, and so it's like every 80 years it repeats itself?
Basically, yes, in a sense. And again, not like somebody hit the reset button in a sci-fi movie sort of way, but just kind of like the
economy goes up and then it crashes on this cycle, and then it
rebuilds and rebounds. You can see it across all kinds of disciplines, family values, and relationships between countries, and wars. Why certain wars start at certain times, and there's these different types of characters. There's like the heroes and the sages and the prophets and they appear and they come through and they do their thing and they serve their role, and then they move to a later stage of life, and then they impact the next cycle because of the experience that they've had. And you've heard the adage we all have, see if I can remember it, but good times make weak men, and weak men make bad times, and bad times make strong men, and strong men make good times. And, and then it just repeats. And so it's kind of like that sort of a situation. That's an oversimplification, but it's essentially just saying, we're not repeating the past exactly, but there's themes and things that happen that lead to a certain inevitability about where we find ourselves today. We're not as deterministic as we think we are, and we're not just moving in one solid linear direction. So of course Trump got elected, because if you put it in the context of these cycles and where we are in the cycle and who came before and how we made decisions, but we only made those decisions because of what happened before, because it was all part of the cycle. And Trump won't be the end, and that we'll see its fruition, and then the next thing will come about to respond to that, just like what happened the last time, and so, it was an interesting way to reframe history and the future of maybe not just circles like an infinite, like stuckness, but more maybe spirals a little better, but we're moving in a direction, but we're also spiraling back on ourselves, repeating the same basic themes over and over again. And so the whole book is kind of making this point. I can't do it justice here in a couple of minutes, but I found that just an interesting reframing, even going back to like Jesus' time in the Bible or any other ancient manuscript, and thinking about the context of why Jesus would have said what he said, given where they were in that cycle of history and development and human understanding and consciousness and that sort of thing. It just kind of reframes everything a little bit differently from being just linear from, we started here and we're moving in this one direction.
Yeah.
It gives it a little bit more of a well-rounded, and it's pretty fascinating. So that was the fourth turning book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Some of the fun stuff I picked out of that. So it is interesting to then kind of overlay that with our talks about, AI and where we're going and the cycles, and maybe someday just like developing fire for the first time, we'll be seen into that sixth dimension of, like we talked about, things coming in, and we never go back, but it is a repeat of waking up in different ways or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Huh.
All right. I think that's what I got. Anything else you want to add?
No. Till next time?
Yeah. Till next time. Thanks.
All right.